We're on lesson 2 of chapter 6, which is estimating with percents. First, we're going to use fractions to estimate with percents. Then we're going to estimate with simple percents. Then we'll do a real world problem. As you may know already, many of these percents that we work with are very similar or exactly the same as these fractions. For example, we know that 50% is the same thing as 1/2. So if I told you I made 50% of my shots, that'd be the same as making 1/2 of my shots. We also know that 25% is 1/4. If you have 1/4, you have 25% of a dollar. If you had 3/4, you would have 75% of a dollar. 10% is the same thing as 1 out of 10. So the more you get to know these, the easier math becomes when we're estimating with percents, as we're going to be doing today. Here it's asking us to use a fraction to estimate 48% of 79. Well, for example, I know that 48% is really close to 50%, which is 1/2. So if I'm going to solve this, I'm going to do 1/2 as my fraction. Remember, we're estimating here, so it won't be exact. And then since we're also estimating, I'm going to make this a nice round number like 80. So we'll do 50% or 1/2 of 80. So we're going to multiply that to get our answer. And since we're multiplying, I did 80 over 1. So we're going to have 1 times 80, which is 80. 2 times 1, which is 2. We're left with an answer of 80 divided by 2, or 80 over 2. 80 divided by 2 is 40. So 40 over 1, or just 40. If we're estimating here, 48%, or almost 1/2 of 79, is about 40. We're going to say about because we're estimating. Let's do the same thing for this word problem. Cam Sports is offering 20% off a basketball that costs $19.99. The same basketball costs $14.99 at Hoops Haven. Which store offers the better deal? So first we need to find 20% of this, and then we need to take it off this total number, and then we can compare it to the $14.99 and see which one's bigger. Well, if we're going to find 20% of $19.99, I know 20% is the same as 1/5. So if we would say 1/5 times $19.99, I'm going to estimate $19.99 as $20 then. So 1/5 times 20 over 1. Then we can get our answer. 1 times 20 is 20. 5 times 1 is 5. 20 divided by 5 then would be 4. So it would be $4 off. So if we do $19.99 or 20 minus 4, that will equal $16. So that's how much this basketball would cost with 20% off the price. We found 20%, took it off the price, $16. The same basketball costs $14.99 at Hoops Haven. So this one would be less expensive then. So we're going to say Hoops Haven offers the better deal. Now we're going to estimate with simple percents, meaning 1% is a really simple percent, as is 10%. 1% is 1/100th of something. 10% is 1/10 of something. So for example, if I had 900, 1/10 of 900, if we move our decimal over, would be 90. That'd be 10% of 900. 1% would be, move that over again, 9. 9 is 1% of 900. That's why those are so easy to work with. You just got to move the decimals over. So for example, if we have 3% of 59, we can do some estimating here. I'm going to make 59 60, and we need to find 3% of 59. Well, I'm going to use 1%. I know that 3% is 1% times 3. So I can find 1% of 60 and then multiply that times 3. Well, 1% of 60, if we move that over, would be 1, 2. So it would be 0.6. So 0.6 equals 1%. And then remember, we got to do the 1% times 3. So 0.6 times 3. 0.6 times 3 would be 1.8. So 1.8 will be our answer here. And we're going to say about 1.8. So you understand what we did? We took 1% times 3 to get 3%, found 1% of 60, which was 0.6, and remember we had to multiply that times 3, which gave us 1.8. Let's try that with this one. Let's use the 10% method for this one. 18% is really close to 20%. 45 is a nice number, so we can leave that as 45. Well, I know that 20% is 10% times 2. So we could find 10% of 45 and then multiply that times 2. So if we have 45, 10% of that would be only one decimal move over, so 4.5. So 4.5 equals 10%. Remember, we got to multiply that times 2 now, so 4.5 times 2, that equals 9. So our answer would be about 9. So just to recap again, we had 20% of 45. 20% is 10% times 2. So we found 10% of 45, which is 4.5. Multiply that times 2, and that gave us 9. Let's use a word problem then. It says Eric and Selena spent $25.85 for their meals at a restaurant. How much money should they leave for a 15% tip? Well, I know that 15% would be 10% plus 5%. That's usually how I solve these when I'm at the restaurant. So first we could find 10% of this meal, then we could find 5% of this meal, and then add those totals together and get our tip amount. $25.85 is really close to $26. So let's find 10% of $26 and then 5% of 26. So 10% of 26 would be, move that decimal over, would be 2.6 or $2.60 equals 10%. Now we need to find 5%. Well, 5% is 1/2 of 10%. So we could find 1/2 of 2.6. 2.6 divided by 2 would be 1.3. So I know that $1.30 equals 5%. So just like I said, we could add 10% and 5% together. So it would be $3.90 equals 15%. So this would be the tip that you want to leave at the restaurant. So we would say about $3.90 for the tip.